Chosen one, welcome, radiant souls, chosen and carved by something bigger than this world. You didn't just stumble here by accident, you were summoned. Look around. If you're here, it means you carry something rare, something the ordinary can't quite name and the systems can't quite touch. And tonight, we're about to talk about you, the ones who confuse the algorithms, shake the watches, and make entire rooms shift without even trying. You've been underestimated, misread, poked, prodded, and still, here you are, standing, glowing, unapologetic. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how impossible it is to cage what lives inside of you? That's why they keep coming back. That's why they watch. That's why they whisper. Because you walk like you already know the ending. Because you are not here to blend in. You are here to break patterns. So I need you to lean all the way in right now. Forget what they said about you. Forget who tried to dim you. Forget who left. Because they couldn't handle the weight of what you carry. This moment is for you to remember just how anointed, just how untouchable, and just how unexplainable you really are. They're not just watching you, they're learning from you. You're not just surviving, you're teaching. And tonight, we're going to unpack why every step you take rattles the ones assigned to monitor you, and why their confusion is just proof of your purpose. So take a breath, straighten your crown, and get ready, because what we're about to dive into will remind you exactly who you are and why you were never meant to fit into any of their boxes. Let's go. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They thought they were walking into an ordinary task, another routine encounter easily confined to their clipboard and checklists. They expected to categorize what they found, to fit it neatly into their familiar labels of strength or weakness, of ambition or fear. But when they stood closer, something quietly dismantled their certainty. The sensation was unfamiliar, not exactly unsettling, but impossible to name, like hearing a note outside of any known scale. What met them was not merely charisma, nor was it the kind of presence that demands attention through force or charm. Instead, it carried the weight of something older than memory, as if a fragment of some unreachable constellation had inexplicably taken form right there in front of them. This was not a kind of power they had studied before. It did not roar or conquer. It simply existed, unmoved, unhurried, and unbothered by their definitions. They tried to track patterns, but the patterns dissolved. They tried to provoke reactions, but the reactions never came. You moved like someone who had already lived the ending 1,000 times, returning not to win, but to fulfill some quiet promise. And the deeper they watched, the less they understood who was truly observing whom. Equipment faltered. The air felt inexplicably denser. Their words began to tangle, not because of anything said or done, but because what they stood before refused to bend to their frameworks. When they finally stepped back, they weren't reporting a person anymore. They were admitting that something beyond their comprehension had passed through their world and left them questioning which world was truly theirs. Step beyond the screen, join, and help light the way for others. At first, they approached with the confidence of someone convinced of their authority, eyes sharp, pens poised, certain that they could decipher the story piece by piece. To them, it was just another case, another sequence of behaviors to document, expecting resistance, or at least some weakness, to reveal itself. But soon, their script began to collapse, not through confrontation, but because the very ground beneath it became transparent. What they hadn't accounted for was how completely the quiet around you stripped the noise from them, how your composure made their rehearsed performances crack. In your calm, they stumbled over their own motives. In your clarity, their contradictions became glaring. No protests, no accusations came from you, yet somehow their masks grew heavy and their own flaws impossible to ignore. What unsettled them most was not that you defied their narrative, but that their own began to unravel in your presence. They came to uncover you, and instead felt themselves uncovered. Small tells in their voice, the strain behind their practiced smiles, the invisible weight they'd been hiding in their own hearts. You didn't need to expose them, because the space you created did it for them. The longer they lingered, the more they felt seen, not by another person, but by something that slipped past their defenses into the places they didn't want to acknowledge. When the time came to leave, they carried no tidy report, no evidence that fit inside a file. Instead, they walked away holding questions they couldn't unask, about themselves, about what they thought they knew, about what it means to really look. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. They arrived expecting to unearth something buried, convinced that beneath the surface they'd find fractures to exploit, something hidden, something to confirm their quiet suspicions. They were certain everyone carried a fault line, a concealed slip waiting to be revealed. But each layer they peeled back only revealed more of the same: stillness, deliberate choices, a presence shaped by endurance rather than disguise. Every test they set unraveled not chaos, but composure. Every trap they laid was met with a quiet that made them uneasy. Their questions sharpened, their gaze intensified, yet what stared back refused to comply with their assumptions. The stories they hoped to write fell apart in their hands, not because they encountered perfection, but because they encountered depth that could not be commodified. The usual patterns they relied on, finding inconsistency, finding cracks, never appeared, and that absence disoriented them more than failure ever could. What disturbed them most was that there was nothing to tarnish, nothing to diminish. The solidity they encountered was not an act, not a mask, but something earned. And that realization unsettled their own confidence, forcing them to confront the possibility that their mission had been misguided from the beginning. They thought they'd discover a shadow behind the light. Instead, they discovered the light wasn't hiding anything at all. And that discovery left them wordless, staring at the kind of integrity they could neither understand nor undo. They kept circling back, convinced that everyone must have a lever, a pressure point, a moment of weakness to seize. They tried offering subtle openings, compliments laced with expectation, promises disguised as opportunities, thinking such things could sway resolve. But no matter how carefully they orchestrated their approach, the response they sought never arrived. Every move was met with quiet discernment, and their schemes slipped through fingers like water. Frustration turned to desperation, and when persuasion failed, they turned to provocation. They seeded conflict, distorted stories, sharpened their tone in hopes of drawing out anger or surrender. Yet what they found was not defiance or retreat, but something more unshakable, an unwillingness to descend into the noise they created. They threw storms at someone who refused to drown, who stood not because of stubbornness, but because of an inner gravity they couldn't map. They escalated, thinking perhaps pressure alone could wear the strength away. But even in isolation, even surrounded by resistance, nothing fractured. The presence they were trying to subdue kept showing up undiminished, each silence louder than any defense. Only then did they begin to see it clearly. Their usual tools, temptation, conflict, intimidation, had no effect here. The strategies they trusted became useless, not because their target was untouchable, but because what they were up against had nothing to do with ego at all. And as they retreated, they carried with them a reluctant awareness. The power they encountered was beyond the reach of their systems, answering to something they could neither name nor control. Step beyond the screen, join and help light the way for others. They thought they understood the script, assigning roles, assigning motives, as if people could be neatly mapped and classified. Their charts and terms were ready, convinced they would quickly pin down what they were looking at. And at first, they tried to sort it the way they always do, by checking off predictable behaviors, seeking confirmation for their assumptions. But the closer they looked, the more their definitions fell apart. Every conclusion they reached unraveled before they could write it down. There was no volatility, but there was no detachment either. What stood before them held a warmth that refused to cling, a dignity that didn't need an audience. Every gesture contradicted the last assumption. Too steady to be fragile, too humble to be vain, too knowing to be fooled. It was not neutrality nor defiance, but something entirely beyond their expectations. They kept trying to match what they saw to the language they knew, but it was like trying to weigh silence with numbers. The usual patterns of attachment and distance, pride and submission, none of them applied. The discomfort came not from aggression, but from witnessing a presence that didn't rely on pretense or reaction, as though it existed outside their categories altogether. The more they analyzed, the more it became clear they weren't looking at a performance, but at someone who had moved beyond their metrics entirely. And that realization left them not just confused, but exposed, because the boxes they built to measure others suddenly felt laughably small in comparison. They assumed the trap was already sprung. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency in place. To them, it was inevitable, the sequence of pressure and timing that always worked. But what followed was a series of disruptions they couldn't predict. Their schemes began to collapse inexplicably. Plans frayed at the edges. Support they counted on disappeared. Circumstances twisted in ways they couldn't control. What should have been inevitable kept slipping through their hands. At first, they chalked it up to minor flaws in their strategy or chance events. But as the failures repeated, always at the exact moment they thought they had won, they began to sense something else moving through the story. Connections emerged just as they thought they had cut everything off. Unexpected allies rose where there should have been silence. Paths opened when they thought they had sealed them shut. Even during the moments when it looked like everything had turned against what they were watching, it would only rebound with more strength, more clarity. And each time, they felt the weight of something they couldn't name pressing against them. Not defiance, not luck, but a kind of invisible intervention that mocked their precision. They kept trying anyway, though with each attempt, their confidence dimmed, replaced by quiet apprehension. They could no longer pretend it was just coincidence when every setback they engineered turned back on them. Eventually, some of them stopped altogether, not out of respect, but out of quiet fear, whispering now about an unseen force they dared not disturb. And as they stepped back, they carried with them a reluctant certainty that whatever protected what they'd tried to corner was beyond their reach and beyond their understanding. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. They send their best, the ones polished by years of training and taught to read people like maps, convinced no one can hide from their scrutiny. To them, it's just another job. Enter, observe, record, return. But soon, what begins as surveillance dissolves into something else entirely. The longer they remain within your orbit, the less they can keep their own illusions intact. At first it feels like fatigue, a faint disorientation. But then, their emotions begin to surge, sharp and unpredictable, and memories they thought erased start rising like smoke. They struggle to steady themselves, to cling to detachment, but the harder they resist, the more exposed they feel, as if every guarded corner inside them is suddenly illuminated. Even without words, you seem to peel away what they've spent years concealing. Some stagger away quietly, shaken and unsettled by a change they can't articulate, their once assured confidence splintering in silence. Others dig in, trying to outlast the shift, only to watch their composure crack, their own lives turning brittle under the weight of their denial. Equipment malfunctions, their focus blurs, everything they count on to maintain control begins to falter. A few vanish from the task entirely, reassigned, or simply swallowed by fear they won't name. And among them are the rare ones who do not return the same at all, softened, opened, bewildered, but grateful for the strange awakening they didn't seek. For them, the encounter was not a mission, but an uninvited reckoning. And though they will never speak of it plainly, they carry the unmistakable mark of someone who has been irreversibly moved. Those who try to watch you all leave with something they cannot forget, some silenced, some undone, all irrevocably altered. They entered expecting to catch you flinching, convinced they could provoke a reaction to study. But instead, what greeted them was stillness, not the silence of fear, but of someone who had already understood the terrain before stepping into it. Every glance they threw, every carefully chosen phrase, was met not with defense, but with an almost impossible composure. You weren't waiting for their questions to end. You were already taking note of the answers they didn't know they were giving. Without haste, you deciphered them: tone, cadence, fleeting expressions, the rhythm of their movements. Everything catalogued quietly in your awareness. They thought they were testing you, yet you were reading through them like an open manuscript. And while they attempted to pin down your intent, you had already discerned theirs, predicting outcomes they hadn't even planned yet. That awareness disoriented them, because it was something no strategy they knew could neutralize. They expected resistance, but what they met was observation so precise, it stripped the performance from their posturing. While they leaned on their authority, you dismantled it quietly by noticing what they assumed no one could see: the false confidence, the cracks in their narrative, the impatience behind their practiced calm. Every move they made became transparent, and the realization sank in slowly that you were not the subject of their inquiry at all. Instead, they became the ones exposed under a gaze they couldn't evade, not because of intimidation, but because of the clarity of someone who had long since stopped playing by their rules. In the end, they understood something they hadn't prepared for, that the one they came to study had already mapped them completely, and that knowledge left them more unsettled than any resistance ever could. They keep returning because what they encounter defies their understanding. No matter how many times they observe, they cannot settle on a conclusion. Every hypothesis they craft collapses in the face of something they cannot categorize. You move without noise, yet shift the dynamic of a room. You speak with restraint, yet your words seem to ripple long after you leave. You extend kindness, but do not indulge foolishness. You are welcoming, but unreachable, all at once. These contrasts disorient them because they depend on predictability, and you disrupt the patterns they trust. They try to force you into a single narrative, but you hold opposites without conflict, capable of profound care while refusing to compromise your peace, able to let go without hesitation, yet remembering everything, gentle yet commanding enough that no one dares to test you. The unpredictability unnerves them because it reveals how little they can anticipate. Their models, equations, and strategies are useless here because you do not move from wounds or vanity. You move from a place they cannot chart, and so they keep sending others, hoping someone might finally explain how you embody what they were taught could never coexist. They expect you to shatter or to bend, but instead, you remain whole. The more they try to untangle you, the more they realize their instruments were never made for someone like you. And the realization that you do not exist to be solved, that you expose the limits of their systems, leaves them circling endlessly, unsettled by the quiet truth they cannot escape. You are both impossible and undeniable. They entered assuming the job would be straightforward. Observe, report, move on. But they did not expect that simply being near you would strip their defenses bare. Nothing you said or did directly targeted them, yet their composure began to crack in ways they could not explain. They arrived confident, detached, believing themselves immune, but every choice you made illuminated a lack in their own. They watched you move without pretense, live without contradiction, and something inside them began to ache, not out of envy, but out of recognition. They noticed how steady you were when the world frayed, how you stayed whole where others crumbled, and though you never demanded anything of them, they began to feel the weight of their compromises, the little betrayals they'd learned to justify just to get through. Their carefully constructed illusions began to feel brittle. Your quiet consistency made their own excuses ring hollow. Without accusation, you revealed what they had buried in themselves. As they measured you against their expectations, they realized the only thing being measured was their own dissonance. It was not your perfection that confronted them, but your refusal to distort yourself for approval. You were proof that a different way of being was possible, one that required neither masks nor control. And that realization unsettled them, because it demanded they reckon with what they had become. They came to document you, but left consumed by what they saw reflected back, an unspoken challenge to everything false they had learned to call normal. They stood back and watched everything unfold, taking note of every slight and every quiet cruelty aimed your way. They recorded the dismissive glances, the shifting loyalties, the trust betrayed by those closest, the sudden walls erected to keep you out. One by one, they noted how you were excluded, discredited, and undermined by people you had once lifted up. To them, it was all too much for one person to endure and still remain whole. Their expectation was simple, that you would eventually crumble under the relentless pressure, that your calm would fracture, that bitterness would swallow you, that exhaustion would consume you. Instead, what they observed made no sense at all. You didn't collapse, you didn't lash out, you didn't wither. You simply stood taller, more assured each time, meeting every blow with an unshakable steadiness that left them unnerved. Where they anticipated outbursts, they found quiet resolve. Where they expected vengeance, they saw you create rather than destroy. They couldn't reconcile their notes with reality because the depth of harm you endured never translated into the chaos they predicted. Instead of being undone, you seemed refined, like someone who had learned how to turn betrayal into clarity and rejection into fuel. Their frustration shifted into a reluctant awe when it became clear. What you carried could not be broken by cruelty or erased by silence. You emerged not just standing, but elevated, and that unsettled them more than any retaliation could have. They began to realize they weren't documenting weakness. They were witnessing the kind of strength that exposes everything false about how they measure human limits. And in the end, you became not just a case study, but a contradiction, proving wrong every rule they thought they understood about how much a person can endure without losing themselves. They approached with a checklist, prepared to gather facts, confident that you were nothing more than another subject to catalog. But from the moment they entered your space, something shifted in ways they weren't equipped to handle. What they thought would be a sterile exercise of observation became personal, disorienting. Without warning, they found themselves remembering things they had long buried, echoes of choices left unmade, old wounds resurfacing without reason. Your presence unsettled their certainty, stirring questions they had spent years avoiding. At night, they couldn't sleep the same. Vivid impressions haunted them, symbols, scenes, feelings that clung to them like whispers they couldn't quiet. You didn't instruct them or confront them. You simply moved as though already aligned with something they didn't understand. And that alignment pressed on everything they thought they knew about themselves. They became aware of the gaps in their own integrity, the emptiness behind their rituals, the hollowness in their ambition.